Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. Well, it's 4 o'clock Central Time, and that means Dustin Sachs is up. He's going to be speaking about securing your supply chain. Dustin, it's yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Thank you all for sticking in there. I know it's been a long day, but yeah, today we're going to talk about the concept of how to secure your supply chain and some of the threats that exist to supply chains, to cyber supply chains, and some of the tips that we can use to enhance, to remove the rust from our supply chains. I encourage everyone throughout, if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A. Try to answer as many of them as I can, and if not, I will certainly be on Discord afterward, and I will answer as many of the questions as I can there as well. So we'll jump right in. So today we're going to talk about the current state of supply chain attacks. We've heard a lot about them, so we'll talk a little bit, set the stage a little bit. We'll talk about some of the current processes that can and are typically used in TPRM and in supply chain risk management. We'll talk about an area of discussion that doesn't get a lot of talk, but that's really a very interesting and emerging area. It happens to be the focus of my doctoral research, which is the role that cognitive bias plays in the third-party risk management decision-making process. And then finally, as I said, we want to give you something to walk away with. So we'll talk about how to enhance supply chain cybersecurity. So before we can talk about where we should be going or where we can go, we've got to talk about where we're at. So obviously, if you've seen the news over the last, few years, you've certainly seen supply chain attacks. They are happening regularly. Many of the supply chain attacks listed on here, I know, are going to probably give some people some PTSD because they wreaked havoc on holidays over the last couple of years. We're hoping, knock on wood, that the recent trend breaks this year. But you'll see that supply chain attacks are also not a very new thing. They've been around in the cyber world, at least, since, largely since about 2009. That's when we saw some of the first major supply chain attacks that affected cyber. Some of them are lesser known, some of them are more well known. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going into the details of each of these per se, but suffice it to say, it's becoming, as you'll notice, the consistency with which they're happening, and even the frequency with which they're happening is increasing every day. So what's really interesting is it takes about 26 days to detect a supply chain attack from when it kind of first happens to when it's detected. The average cost of a data breach, as we've seen, is right around about $4.35 million, but the average cost of a supply chain compromise is 4.46 million. So that's it. Supply chain, not only is it happening more often, is it becoming a more common attack type, but it's also increasingly more expensive than having an internal breach or a breach, a traditional non-supply chain related breach. So there are various mechanisms that we see associated with supply chain attacks. Some of these overlap, some of these are very similar, but it's really important that we understand them because they set a really interesting story and set an interesting stage for the discussions we're going to have. First is third-party software, and this is where a attacker takes advantage of vulnerability or implants malicious code into third-party software. The example, a representative example of this, and only because the one that I would have put here is used later on, is Equifax. And Equifax back in 2017, it was a compromise of 146.6 million social security numbers and other personal information of consumers. It was caused because of a vulnerability in a third-party piece of software. MSPs or service providers, managed service providers, push out updates or malicious code to remotely monitored and managed computers. Again, the one that I would have used as a representative example here hasn't been used because we're about to talk about it, but this was the example given here is the attack on Kaseya in July of 2021. And as you can see, the impact was there were victims in at least 17 countries, somewhere between 800 and 1,500 businesses. So what you'll see is that it becomes increasingly easier to impact more businesses and more have a higher victim count uh, as supply chain attacks become more and more sophisticated and as supply chain attacks become more and more regular. The one that we all probably use as kind of the benchmark example is an IT vendor or other provider of software and contents. And this is, again, very similar to the third-party software, installing or injecting malicious code into an IT vendor and then propagating that down to customers. And this one is the SolarWinds breach, the one that I would say probably encompasses a good portion of the previous two. And in this case, you had 18,000 out of 300,000 customers impacted, including at least 9 U.S. government agencies that we know of. Again, why, if I can hit SolarWinds or if I can hit a victim once, but then have it propagate down to thousands of customers and impact thousands more, why wouldn't you? It's the one-stop shop. It's the reason that if you look back at traditional data breaches, some of the traditional data breaches typically attacked healthcare, financial, and educational institutions because you have the ability to get a lot more data. Those locations or types of businesses have every piece of information you could possibly want. Partners in the physical supply chain. This is something that we've seen a couple times. We've even seen it recently. Is where implanting a malicious chip or a module on the physical insides of a product can then facilitate a supply chain attack. And we saw this a couple years ago with the Chinese and motherboards being put onto systems that had chips that allowed the Chinese actors within the Chinese infrastructure to remotely access computers that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to. It's a lot of the same stuff behind the recent Huawei attacks and the things that have caused now Huawei to be kind of almost effectively banned in the US. We've also seen this, the attack of on motherboards affected at least 30 companies, including Amazon, Apple, an unknown big bank, multiple government agencies, and even contractors. The other element of supply chain attacks that, while on face value might not seem like cyber attacks, but are nonetheless absolutely vital, are the non-IT contracting vendors. It's where you use a vendor as a springboard to gain access to privileged resources of a target organization. And in this case, the real good example is Target. Target was breached because of the lack of security of cybersecurity in place for the HVAC, the air conditioning vendor for Target. and we all kind of know what that breach did. And we started to see some of these happening more and more. Um, it could be a third party vendor who has nothing to do with IT, but that has access to your environment and gets an MFA fatigue attack, a barrage of MFA attacks, and then gets a message from WhatsApp that says, hey, I'm from IT, please approve this so that I can help fix your computer. And it doesn't even have to be a IT vendor of yours that's doing the work, or an IT contractor that's doing work for you. But if they've got anyone who's got access to your environment is a potential entry point for a supply chain attack, which is why third party risk management is so important in today's world, and especially in the kind of post March 2020 COVID remote work from home, remote work world, where we are relying a lot more on supply chain vendors, where we're relying a lot more on cloud vendors, where we're relying on uh, putting data in places that we may not have full control over, all of the pieces of the compute environment in the way that we used to in a traditional, everything is stored on a mainframe or server within the organization. Another area that has laid out some really good explanations about various supply chain attacks is in the in the communications, information communications technology area. And this is a graphic from CISA that actually they put out as part of a report into some of the communications IT supply chain risks. And they lay out a lot of the same types of attacks. The other one that's really the one that I'll jump to, because I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this specific one, is sensitive data spillage. It's really important to remember that as part of your supply chain, if you're disposing of computers and you have a vendor, or you're donating them, or you're working with somebody downstream, that's another potential area for a supply chain, for a data breach to occur. Is you failed to properly clean your computers, or you gave it to a vendor to do disposal and they didn't properly wipe the devices. So that's a really important one. So when we talk about, most organizations, I know a lot of organizations have for many years kind of struggled with the TPRM process. They, usually there's not enough resources, personnel resources. It may be one person doing that in addition to five other jobs, or it's one person who's dedicated to TPRM, but you've got an inordinate number of vendors in play. And it can be a very big process that can oftentimes be viewed as a bottleneck if it's not organized and built correctly. So one of the best ways to kind of shake the rust off of your TPRM process is to look at what processes are out there, what existing things are out there, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I had a discussion actually just maybe an hour ago with my CISO about the fact that the questionnaires that we're using, for example, may need to be optimized because they are not the most effective tool that we could be using, or they're not in the most effective format. So there's some really good standards documents. I'm going to talk about both NIST, and I'll talk a little bit about ISO and some other ones. I focus on NIST not because I have any affinity for or affiliation with the federal government in the US, or that I have any sort of preference for the federal government, but I use it because even if you're not in the federal government, many of the guidelines that are in some of these documents are really, really good for anybody who is looking for at least a starting point or doesn't have practices in place and wants to do it quickly. The first is NIST Special Publication 800-161. This is a document that is specifically focused on how to best do supply chain risk management, um, again, geared towards federal information systems, but very much applicable to the wider organization, or the wider industry beyond the government. Of course, everybody, I think, tries to leverage in some form or fashion the NIST cybersecurity framework, or that's how you're reporting things to the board, or to outside auditors. And while the NIST cybersecurity framework is just that, it's a framework, it is built on the controls that exist within NIST Special Publication 853. We're currently on revision version 5. Unless you have nothing better to do or you're really desperate for sleep, I would not advise trying to read the entire NIST 853 document. It is a behemoth and you will fall asleep more than one time. But what is really important about it from a supply chain standpoint is that it is now really, at one of the big additions was more focus on supply chain, more focus on controls and guidance around supply chain. So if you're measuring yourself against the NIST cybersecurity framework or against NIST Special Publication 853, you will need to be dealing with supply chain in some form or fashion. The other one that's really a really interesting one is NIST IR 7622, which is titled Notional Supply Chain Risk Management Practices. What this really is this is a really good way for anybody who is trying or who wants to take a more quantitative approach, to supply chain risk management, similar to some of the quantitative methods that are being used for internal risk management. This document lays out a really nice framework and a really nice set of practices for anybody who is looking to try to implement that and doesn't know where to start. All of these documents, what's nice about all of these documents is if you're not in the federal government or there's not a mandate somewhere that you abide by NIST, you can tailor these documents very much and use them as a guidepost to developing your own program. And I will say my own organization, I'm looking at, in my role as the head of GRC, I'm looking at ways to increase our usage and reliance and leverage the pieces within NIST 161 and NIST IR 7622 to enhance our cybersecurity, for our supply chain. For those of you who are fans of ISO, obviously there's ISO 27001, and then there's and the companion, very similar to kind of the NIST cybersecurity framework, where the framework is separate of the controls. NIST 27001, or I'm sorry, ISO 27001 is the equivalent of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's, you should set up a management system. This is what it should look, what the guiding principles. NIST 27 or ISO 27002 is the equivalent of NIST 853. It's all the list of controls and suggestions and things that you need to do if you're looking to try to get certified under ISO 27001. And then the other one that I point out is ISO 27036, information security for supplier relationships. This is another really great document for anybody who has a global reach, beyond the US, and wants to leverage the ISO framework in order to do their standards. You know, in an ideal world, in a perfect situation, you can pick and choose and leverage the best from NIST and the best from ISO and create the best program for yourself and for your organization. What's really interesting is, and this is a bit dated, but is still very much, I think, largely still very true, is the types of practices that most organizations are using when it comes to supply chain risk management. Most of that, you know, most organizations are doing at least some sort of review on the personnel that will be um, or leveraging the vendor that they're working with to do personnel security reviews, or are looking at enhancing their own perimeter, um, or trying to create a more standardized process. But they're doing everything but kind of very well tracking supply chain risk. It's kind of one of those things that you could put it together and you can give some metrics. You may be able to talk about which vendors the highest risk or the lowest risk, but we're not tracking supply chain risks in the same manner that we are for internal risks, where we've got a formal risk register. Now, certain organizations will do that. A lot of organizations are trying to start to do that, but it's still an area that is really lacking. So we've talked about the state of of supply chain attacks. We've talked about current risk management processes. What's a really interesting element of, and adds quite a bit of what we'll call rust for the purposes of this discussion, a lot of problem to the third party risk management process, is some of the subjectivity that it's given. And I know that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work on the internal risk management side to take things from a qualitative, subjective system to a more objective uh, cyber risk quantification methodology. The problem with cyber risk quantification in a third-party risk management world is good luck getting the cost of a data breach from some of your vendors, or having them truly peel back the onion for you on the numbers that you would need to be able to do a good cyber risk quantification. The other problem is, for many organizations, that you may have hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors that you're dealing with, and to come up with the impact that a vendor might have on the organization is a very tricky thing. So, but one of the real kind of interesting areas is actually in the decision-making process itself, and some of the challenges that we face with how we are evaluating our vendors. If you think about most of the vendors that, for anybody who does third-party risk assessments or does third-party risk management on a daily basis, some of the rationale that is used for selecting a specific vendor by key decision makers and even by cybersecurity decision makers, what you find is that it's oftentimes not a truly risk-based approach, but it's got elements of cognitive bias. So to talk through that, I think it's important to lay out what do we mean when we're talking about bias, because bias is a very, very much, I recognize, a charged word. Bias is, by definition, is just the disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing. You can actually be positive, have a positive bias towards something. You know, the example I will give is, you might have a most people have a bias towards not getting injured. They will do things to try to, they will make decisions with a bias towards not getting hurt or not putting themselves in positions where they could be hurt. That's a good bias to have. that certainly probably makes family members a lot happier. But on the other end, there is bias against something, and that can oftentimes be um, be viewed negatively. Um, but when we're talking about what we're talking about cognitive biases. So they are not necessarily good or bad, regardless of which end of the spectrum in favor of or against a thing they fall. They are a systematic pattern of deviation from the norm or the rationality in judgment. Anytime you're making a decision that is, not the normal decision to make in that situation, if you analyze the decision, it oftentimes includes some element of cognitive bias. Now, another concept that is really important with cognitive bias is heuristics. And heuristics is a process of using mental shortcuts. When I talk about this, the best example I can give you is heuristics is what helps you make decisions quickly and get to a decision that is the best, or good enough to satisfy some criteria. Because if we as humans did a full true risk analysis of decisions we make in a given day, the only decision we would make is to not get out of bed, because that is the safest decision for every other decision we would need to make in the day. But we see heuristics used often in situations of uncertainty. And that's where, when we talk about third-party risk management and we talk about the easiest way to apply Rust or have a flawed third-party risk management program, is when we introduce some of these mental shortcuts and let them drive our decision making instead of understanding them and controlling them. I'm not going to go through all of these. I don't expect anyone to be able to see this really well. I share it because I think what it demonstrates is, first of all, this is known as the Cognitive Bias Codex, and it is a listing of the 180 known cognitive biases out there. This is put out by Wikimedia, which is an offshoot of Wikipedia. What's really nice about that is if you were to go in and click on any one of these biases listed, it will actually take you to a whole Wikipedia page that will explain a lot and provide a lot of good reference material, but it will show you the way that biases are often grouped. There are over 180 cognitive biases out there, and we're not going to go through all of them. We're not even going to go through all of the ones on this page. What we're really going to talk through and what we're really going to go through is some of the key ones that we see often in third-party risk management that are really good to be aware of, because they can be kind of the easiest place for a non-risk-based decision to be made. And the first one I'll go to is anecdotal evidence. How many times, I don't know where everyone is, but how many times have you gotten a recommendation for a movie or a restaurant that somebody else told you, you've got to go to this restaurant, or you've got to see this movie, it was so great, or this restaurant was so great, the service was impeccable, and then you go to that same movie or that same restaurant and have a horrible experience, and you're like, what the hell was that person thinking telling me that? What you've become the victim of unknowingly is you've unknowingly become the victim of anecdotal evidence. You've relied on the information and the experience of another person to make your decision. And when we do that in a supply chain scenario, we may pick a vendor that other people have told us is great, and we do it because so and so recommended that I reach out to you. And you end up becoming blinded to that, and you're not looking at the things that could potentially be risks. The bandwagon effect. Everyone's using them. I hate to bring this one up, but the bandwagon effect is largely why so many victims of SolarWinds occurred. Everyone was using them. They're the one to use. They're you've got to use them or else. That's where bandwagon comes in. I'm going to skip the Dunning-Kruger because although I will call it out because I think anyone who's suffering from imposter syndrome would really benefit from learning a little bit more about the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a really interesting one, but it could be its own presentation on its own, separately. I will mention false consensus. False consensus is the bias or the idea that I'm making the decision that I'm making because I believe that's what the rest of the group would decide if they were faced with the decision. Or if I were to go ask 4 other people, this is what they would decide. It can often be considered or analogized to a people pleasing. I want to please as many people as possible. So I'm going to pick the decision I think that they would pick. It may be true, but it likely is not true or may not be completely true. First impression, that one I think is a fairly obvious one, but I'll call it out as well. Frequency, the more often we see something, the more likely we are to think that it occurs more often. Ransomware is a great example. We see a lot of talk about ransomware. Ransomware is certainly a major epidemic within cybersecurity, but there are plenty of other things that are as dangerous and as bad and happening as often that we just don't see. So we believe that the frequency of ransomware is higher than it is a higher risk than it really is. Motivated reasoning, that's where you allow your emotions to play into things. The one that I'm going to jump down to because I really want to talk about this one is sunk cost fallacy. This is, for those who are not familiar, this is the bias or the belief or the fallacy or the predetermined nature to say, well, we've already spent money on this and we've already spent time on this and we've already expended a bunch of effort on this. So we're stuck with it because it would cost more to go to do it the right way, or what might be the less risky way, because we've already spent so much money on this. It's one to be very careful of because very often, if you look at the true cost of things over time, the sunk cost fallacy goes away. Unfalsifiability, I like to use this one because this is the anytime you've heard somebody say, well, this is the decision I've made unless you can prove me wrong. And usually when they say that, it's something that there is no possible way for you to ever prove them wrong. How can you prove to me that that you don't beat your wife? I can't ever prove that. But so then I'm going to say, I'm going to say that, I'm going to make a decision based on that, or, until you can prove me wrong, I believe this, and therefore I'm going to stick to my guns. I like to use I'm going to jump back up to the Peltzman effect for a minute because I like to talk about this one for both personal reasons and because I think it's an interesting one in information security. But the Peltzman effect is the idea that if the perception is that you are safe in a safe place or safer, you're more likely to take risks you would not take. The example I always like to use here is my wife is a registered nurse. I am not a medical professional, nor do I play one on TV. However, I always joke with people that I have a get out of jail free, do stupid stuff uh, excuse because I have a medical professional who can increase my safety. You might see that in the same in an information security standpoint with, well, we've got MFA, so we're safe, so we're not a victim until you have an MFA fatigue attack. So let's talk about some of the models of heuristics. These are really important as well because it's important to understand, because you will see a lot of these decision-making models in the decision-making and the analysis that is often done of third parties. The first is what's known as satisficing, and that's kind of the um, the gold standard, or at least the basis behind heuristics. It is the idea that that humans make decisions to satisfy a level of standard that they've set up. This was first developed back in the mid 1950s, and exists largely to help people make quick, easy decisions. Elimination by aspect, that's where you talk about a lot of the making decisions based on, I'm going to first, I'm going to look at cost, and I'm going to eliminate the item that is the highest cost. And now I've got maybe three solutions left. And I make those three solutions, I look at those three decisions that are left, and I go, now I'm going to get rid of it based on the number of people who work at the vendor company, and what have you. And you continue to do that until you have a single vendor. We see this often, or a single decision, and we see this often in the RFP process, where we're eliminating not based on which is the riskiest, but based on some other facet. They which one gave us the best demo, which one has the most new features coming in the next 6 months. The recognition bias, or recognition heuristic. The example I like for this one is, my grandfather used to, as a reward for us when we would do something, would give us an option, and he'd show us a $2 bill and he'd show us a $1 bill, and he said you could have either one that you want. Most young kids don't recognize that a $2 bill is a real thing. Therefore, they take the $1 bill because they recognized it more readily, they understood it more readily, and they actually, in doing that, gave up 100% of what they could have had. The last thing is the take the best. And this is essentially where you create a decision tree, but you create the decision tree in almost a bracket tournament style kind of setup. I'm going to take two decisions and I'm going to make the decision, and I'm going to go, okay, which of these, I've got 5 decisions. Okay, I'm going to narrow them down to 3. Then I'm going to narrow them down to 2. Then I'm going to narrow them down to 1. Or I'm going to take this one and I'm going to compare it to another thing. And you go, okay, I like option A, not option B. Think of the example I'd give here is if you've ever gone to the eye doctor, where they go, which one's better, the left or the right, 1 or 2, 1 or 2. And then they take one of whichever one you've chosen. And then they go, okay, what about 2 or 3? It's the same kind of concept of decision-making. So how do we enhance our cyber supply chain? How do we take all of this knowledge that we've learned, all of these things that we've identified that cause rust? How do we apply? What can we do to help mitigate the effect of them? And I say mitigate because cognitive bias is like when you're a little kid trying to stay up till midnight on New Year's. You say, I'm going to stay up until midnight. I'm going to stay up until midnight. And at 9:30, you're passed out because you tried as hard as you could to do it, and you're never going to be able to beat it. It's the same thing. You may be able to mitigate the effect or recognize that you've introduced a bias, but you're never going to be able to fully eliminate a bias. And there are certainly situations where completely eliminating bias is not a good thing. So there are a couple of really good resources. The first that's out there is the NIST IR 8276. Why do I bring this up? Because for any organization that's looking, or any group that is looking for an easy framework to put in play and to put in play quickly, this has got a really good layout and structure for CSCRM, or Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management. You leverage what's out there. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. The place where organizations that I've seen have struggled the most is they've struggled the most when they try to do it themselves from scratch. You can make a good cake doing it on your own from scratch. You can make an even better cake if you use a recipe that was done by, Julia Child, or Emeril Lagasse or somebody like that. You wouldn't. So why not leverage what's already out there? There are a couple other really good tools. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because I want to give time for questions. But some other really good tools. Happy to talk with people about any of these tools. The one big thing to keep in mind is, as part of supply chain risk management, is don't discount the importance of thinking about business continuity and disaster recovery, because as many organizations now have outsourced a lot of their critical functions to third-party vendors, they don't have a good contingency plan in place. And the example I'll give on this one is the Kronos breach that happened at the end of last year. Kronos, for those of you who don't know, is a major payroll provider. And about 2 weeks prior to Christmas, almost exactly 2 weeks prior to Christmas, they had a massive ransomware attack. I know this because not only was my company, the company I was at the time, affected, but it was the day before payroll for my wife's hospital, and they used Kronos. So it turns out they had to come up with a contingency plan because they hadn't actually effectively planned for what happens if the payroll system goes down a day before payroll is due. And oh, by the way, it's also during the holidays season, so it's not like we can go, well, we'll get it to you in a week. People were really relying on that money, and people rely on their paychecks being delivered when they're supposed to be delivered. So don't discount business continuity. There's a really good document. Again, this is focused on the communication sector, but this is put out by CISA. It's the Vendor Supply Chain Risk Management Template. If you're looking for good questionnaire or good forms to use with your vendors, this is a really good starting point. Probably overkill for most organizations, but again, it's another good way to be like, hey, did we forget to include something we should have included? What are the tips for debiasing, for minimizing bias? Well, the first is to be aware. The fact that you're aware of it makes it harder to ignore it. It goes back to a concept that I've talked about in other presentations of in physics, the concept of the observer principle, the idea that once you look at something, you've changed it and you can't you basically can't unsee it. Educate yourself. Attending sessions like this, learning about biases, figuring out which are the biases that you might be more susceptible to or may be the victim of. Consider current factors that may be influencing your decision. I didn't talk about it, but there's a concept known as noise that is a really interesting topic to look at. A Nobel Prize winning economist by the name of Daniel Kahneman and a couple others came up with or talked about noise. And noise is the idea that things that are outside of bias, outside of heuristics may play an impact. How many people, think to yourself, but how many of you make a great decision at 5 o'clock on a Friday as opposed to at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday when you're making decisions about security or work related topics? Reflect on the past. Look at what you've done in the past and where you might have made mistakes in the past. Be willing to look for disconfirming evidence. Be willing to look for things that might explain, that might go against what your beliefs are or what your conclusions are. If nothing else, it will help either strengthen your decision making and say, hey, I considered the alternative and the alternative doesn't work. Or you're going to hear it and you're going to see it and you're going to go, oh crap, I didn't even think about that. And that goes with practicing intellectual humility. Human decision making is flawed. It just is. It's impossible for humans to truly make the right decision, the exact optimal top right decision. We make the best decisions we can. So be willing to accept that your decision making may be flawed. I don't have time to talk about it, but I would also encourage anybody who's interested in looking at things, other ways to perhaps debias your decision making. There's a whole area of research being done right now on automated decision support. Again, this could be a whole presentation in and of itself. If B-Sides asks me to come back next year, I'd be happy to present on automated decision support because it's a huge area of advancement going on, and there are a lot of really interesting techniques that can be used to leverage a lot of the existing artificial intelligence you're aware of, machine learning and what have you, to make better decisions. Because as all of us know, the human brain, computers actually have better computing power now than the human brain, and have since about 2010. So don't be afraid to let automated decision support be a part of your system. Now, there are certainly questions about it and flaws and concerns about it, because automated decision support is being used in limited format on loans and credit-based decisions. But there are ways that automated decision support can also analyze big data better than humans can. If there are any questions, I'll entertain them now. I will also pop over to Discord and see if there are any questions over there, and I'll answer them over there. If there are, please put your questions into the question and answer. I've included in the slides that will be included afterward or shared afterwards, some references. The reason I use, even though I'm a doctoral student and an academic and don't like to reference Wikipedia in an academic setting, I reference Wikipedia here because it's a good jumping off point for these topics to other areas and other groups and other things. I've got the codex there, cognitive bias and how to overcome it. And then here's my information. Please feel free to reach out. I've given all of my email addresses, my personal website, my LinkedIn. I'm always excited to talk about this with people. I love talking about these topics and talking about cognitive bias, third-party risk management, GRC, cybersecurity in general. So thank you all for attending. I know it's later in the day, and if you're outside of the central time zone, it could be even later in the day. Appreciate everyone attending, and I don't see any questions, so I will hand it back over to our moderators.
Thank you for an excellent talk, Dustin. You're right, there are no questions here, but we've had a lot of engagement over in Discord, so I would expect to see people there instead.
Yep, I will definitely be over in Discord as soon as we're done here.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
It's tough to have two screens opened at the same time. So.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks very much. We're going to take a break until 5 o'clock Central Time. And do come back, because our next two presentations will not be recorded. So you're going to want to catch those live at 5 o'clock and 5:30 Central. See you soon.